like to introduce Scott Patterson, probably the best auctioneer that I've seen consistently over the last 20 years, but I've been told to write top 5 auctioneers so I don't have everybody texting me in saying, hey, I'm better than Scott. Whatever it is, Scott, you're certainly one of the best auctioneers I've seen, and you've been consistently that for a number of decades. I'm really happy that you've come in here today because I think people are going to learn. They're going to learn a lot about the auctioneering business and what goes on behind the scenes and what they thought was happening probably isn't happening. So, welcome, Scott.
Thank you, Mel. Thanks for having me.
I think our history goes back. Well, our history goes back about 20 years. Probably even longer. And I remember when we first started to sort of feature you in market news, which was now almost 17 years ago, you were always known as Pretty Boy Patterson. Now, obviously, you've faded a fair bit since then, but that was always something that they always thought you were the best looking auctioneer anyway, so that was a good start.
I thought you made it up, Mel, but that's fine. I'm happy to accept that. And yes, we do get older. Can't stop that.
We do. So let's get into it. Let's get down to a couple of quick questions. So how long have you been in the business? Have you always auctioned, and why did you get into it?
Well, I started in real estate straight out of school. Finished in 87. In 88, I started in real estate. But I didn't actually go into sales until I was 27 years old. So I purposely waited. I wanted to get a grounding in property management. I also did some work in the relocation industry as well, which gave me a great bird's eye view of everything going on in Melbourne and who the best agents were, perhaps. And then I decided to come into sales at the age of 27 and joined Jealous Craig at the time. And I think I was actually the first PA that somebody put on. So it was right at the beginning when that started to become a fashionable thing to do. So I started probably a little later than most people, but I've been going ever since. I'm 52 now, so I've been in the business for about 35 years.
So kids, families, holidays, sort of just tell us a little bit about yourself personally and where you like to travel with the kids.
Sure. Well, I'm married to Isabella, have been for 20 years.
Yeah.
We've got 3 boys. Yeah. One's about to turn 17. Yeah. And the other 2 twins, 14, going on 15.
Right.
So 3 boys, busy household, physical household. Luckily, Isabella has a background in real estate too. She worked at Cane Burton once upon a time, but also her brother is in real estate, Michael Armstrong. Her father, Paul Armstrong, sold the first $1 million house in Toorak many years ago. So she's surrounded by...
St George's Road.
Correct.
Yep.
So she's surrounded by auctioneers and real estate, and so she's very supportive, which is great, and understands the sort of hours that I have to put in from time to time. When we travel, we don't go far. We go to Flinders most of the time. That's where her parents live. I grew up in Lorne, in the Lifesaving Club there. I used to do a lot of surfing in my 20s.
So you're a surfer?
I used to be.
So I think we'll talk about this sort of a bit later on, but I've always felt you've been able to stay fresh. Like you just said, you've been in there 35 years.
Yep.
And that's, is it 35 or 25?
35.
35, wow. How do you stay sort of vital?
I always have loved it. I love the variety of real estate in general, and just the auctions that I do week to week. There's never 2 circumstances that are the same. There's never 2 houses that are the same, and I quite like the variety of the job. So I enjoy that. I also get a lot of satisfaction out of managing a team and growing a team. We have 23 people at our Hawthorn office.
And you started it from zero, basically?
Yeah, Sam Wilkinson and I started that office, really. And it's grown, but it's a manageable sized group of people. And there's a lot of harmony. It's nice. We're a good team. And I get satisfaction seeing people grow within that too. So that keeps me interested. That inspires me, keeps me fresh. I have many breaks here and there. I don't work myself to the bone. My father passed away very early at 57 of a heart attack, and that I believe was caused by stress. So at the time I said to myself, I'm not going to do the same thing. I'm here for the long haul. I do intend to continue working till I'm 70 if I can. That's my plan. So I do want to make sure that it's a marathon, not a sprint. And for that reason I take care of myself as I go along.
What about your biggest deal you've been involved in, and what's been your sort of favourite deal?
Biggest deal would be the sale of a house in Harcourt Street in Hawthorn East. That went for between 16 and 17 million. That was a good sale a few years ago.
Was that an auction?
No, that was a EOI.
Right.
But we sold that to a client who we knew would be very well suited to it. So that was good. Most satisfying sale is probably 31 Canterbury Road, and the reason for that is I originally sold it to someone for $1 million many years ago. It's a big home with a tennis court.
Yep.
And then my competitors came in and sold it once and then another one the next time, and both of them really let me know that they were in there and they'd sold it.
Yeah.
And then I had the last laugh, thankfully, and sold it for $8 million a few years ago after it was renovated. So that's the last time it transacted. So that was probably quite a satisfying one.
Yeah, and you would have made that. You would have made the calls and just let them know. Or no, you're too decent for that. Are you?
I didn't say a word until now.
But make sure everybody hears that. Okay.
That's right.
Right. Let's get into a couple of things. Auctions do have. Well, auctions and Melbourne go together. So everybody's got an opinion on auctions. Everybody's got an opinion on what's right and what's wrong with them. Let's start off with a couple of slightly more controversial things. Dummy bidding. I think dummy bidding happens at the moment.
I don't think it's been stamped out completely.
Right.
We certainly would never be a part of it.
Mm-hmm. And I've never seen you, I've never felt you've been involved in it, by the way.
No, and if I got a whiff that something like that was going on, I would stop an auction. That's how I feel about it. I feel quite strongly about it.
Yeah.
I was very happy when it was outlawed because I do find it's very misleading. I thought it was a misleading way of doing business.
Yep.
It was creating an artificial market.
Yep.
And I love the transparency now.
Yep.
Surprisingly, we do still have vendors who say that they would like to take up the offer of their mate or their friend to do bidding, and we have to stop them and say that's not allowed, it's illegal, you can't do that, and we won't allow it to happen.
Underquoting. What's your views on underquoting, and how rife do you think that is?
Well, every agent does this differently. My personal approach is to put forward a range that is in tune with what I told the vendor and have credibility. That's really how I prefer to treat it.
Right.
Particularly if the property doesn't sell at the time and you then have to move forward with negotiations, whether it be straight after an auction or the following days or weeks. If you've got the range right and you've got a vendor who's prepared to do business in that range, then you've got credibility with the buyer. I don't like the way that I see people do it, where they do purposely quote things a bit lower in order to generate interest, and then they perhaps move it up or they don't move it up, and then they get to auction day and sure, it flies, but it was always going to fly because that quote was a bit low. So I don't like the practice. Again, I don't think the system is right. I don't think it's correct the way that it's set up at the moment, where the vendor has full control. The agent doesn't have control, really. I think that's the problem.
I think a lot of people don't understand that the agent is not in control of the quoting. The agent affects the quoting by putting forward something, but it's ultimately the vendor that decides what the reserve shall be.
A vendor will not necessarily give you a definitive reserve at the beginning or along the way. So it's a bit of a guessing game, and that is the dilemma I think that agents have, is that they don't know what the vendor's reserve is going to be.
So do you think buyer knowledge over the years has increased a lot? Because I've certainly feel that from 20 years ago to now, there seems to be a greater level of knowledge. I'm not sure that every buyer understands everything, but there seems to be more knowledge out there with the TV shows and all that, but I don't know. What's your views?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, buyers have got so much more information at their fingertips than ever before. They used to have to rely on contacting the agent and talking to the agent about the property and about where the pricing might be and so forth and what the comparable sales might be. But these days, they can look at all of that themselves quite easily, and they can engage professionals such as yourself, Mel, to give them that information too. So I think buyers are well armed with information.
Boroondara, which is Kew, Hawthorn East, Camberwell, etc. That has been the strongest market. Well, basically since the GFC, things started to turn, and with the FIRB changes and the money coming in from China, that has been an incredibly strong market. But with a lot of people coming from China or newly to Australia, obviously language is a big issue. How have you found that over the years?
Yeah, well, you're right about the market there. It's driven by the activity with schools, but the statistics are showing it. There's a lot more activity in Boroondara at the moment. As far as language goes, I mean, we have people on our team who speak Mandarin, Cantonese and other languages in order to overcome any language barriers. But the vast majority of the buyers that we deal with do have a grasp of the English language, and they can speak the language quite well.
Let's talk about on the market. I think a lot of people sort of misunderstand it, and it is connected in with underquoting and on the market and a few things like that. Let's just cover that subject for a moment, if you don't mind. What does when somebody asks for on the market, what does that actually mean?
Well, it means we've reached the reserve price and the vendor's given us permission to sell to the highest bidder, subject to the interest of any other parties who may wish to now step forward and place a bid. So we're playing for keeps, essentially, from that point on. So if somebody hears the words that it is on the market, that means that person who's holding the bid now buys the property.
I do think there's a situation where in markets that are particularly hot, you can be quoting what you think is fair and reasonable. It goes $1 million over the reserve. That's not underquoting. If you're quoting a reasonable level and it's in line with what the vendor wants and it's what you think it's worth and you've had no other offers in writing at that time and it's still sales well past and you put it on the market, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, that's free market forces.
Yeah.
That's what I was saying before about the one I had in Kew recently, where it was on the market at, I think it was 3.6 and it went to 5.2.
Wow.
Now, it was announced on the market.
Was that your talent?
Yeah, absolutely. It was within the range that we'd been quoting, the top end of the range, but it was released onto the market, and that's why I had no issue with that, because that was then the free market forces pushing it.
Okay.
If that's the case, but look, that was a unique property on a cliff top.
Yep.
Very hard to value.
Yep.
It was only a smaller 3-bedroom house, but it was just a unique location. So with unique properties, it's not that easy.
Is the property sold when that's done, or is the property sold when the pen and paper exchange?
Well, technically, it's when it's signed.
Yes.
When both parties sign, and then the contracts are exchanged.
Yes.
That's technically when it's a done deal.
Yeah.
Before that, though, if we say 1, 2, 3 sold, I believe there's an obligation that we should be dealing with that person.
Right.
So that person's brought inside swiftly and sat down, and we do the contracts with them, and we have the vendor countersign. But during that time, and I have seen it over the years, something can go wrong. I mean, the buyer can also walk in and say, "Oh, I'm having a panic attack and I don't want to sign anything." That's happened. I've seen that occur.
It's happened twice to us. Not so much the panic attacks, but more we've been second and ended up buying the properties.
Right.
But
I've never seen a vendor renege on signing a contract. I've never seen that. But I have seen the odd buyer get the wobbles.
Yeah. Is there any sort of properties that you would not auction, for instance? So when I'm a vendor, and thank you very much, Scott, for coming along. And do you think we should auction our property or not?
Well, I guess we look at each individual property and look at whether it's likely to have multiple bidders, whether there's enough ticks in the right boxes to be able to get competition to happen for that particular home. If we think that it is perhaps more suited to a one buyer type scenario, there could be a variety of reasons for it, then there may be a better method, such as an EOI or even a private sale with a price. I mean, a public auction is quite a tense time for people selling and for buyers as well, of course, but it's a nervous day, and not everybody wants half the neighbourhood turning up to watch what's going on.
Generally speaking, auctions, if you've got multiple bidders, if you feel confident you've got multiple bidders on a property, then you believe you're going to get a better price from auction than if you do go through an EOI or a private sale or an off-market process. Is that as a general rule? Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I mean, if the property is saleable and everything looks okay as far as expectations and presentation and marketing goes, then we should be confident going to the market with a confident strategy, and that is to put it up for an auction. I think it's just a very good structured way of getting things to happen within a certain period of time. The vendors are typically ready to sell on that day or before, and the buyers are naturally emotionally geared up to come along and to give it their best shot.
Are there selling seasons? I've always I've been pushing a fair bit lately to try and sort of clarify in people's minds out there that there are times that you do sell, or not so much that you should sell in those times, by the way, just more that there seems to be very strong times in Melbourne when people do sell in large numbers, and then there's times that are weak. It
depends on the property. Again, if it's a property that has a garden as its absolute feature, then it should be sold in spring, because that's when it's going to look its best. But otherwise, we just look at supply and demand, really. At the moment, for example, there is a shortage of properties. Even though Boroondara is a bit more active than other areas, there's still a shortage of properties. And for that reason, it may be best for the vendor to consider now as opposed to later in the year when they might have more homes to compete against. if they're out there in the market with only 2 or 3 homes competing as opposed to 9 or 10, then that will naturally draw more buyers to their property and potentially influence the price.
I always find there's a little bit of a pep, there's a little bit of oomph in the market in the opening parts of the market, because people like February, early March, because people have had 6 weeks of doing not much, and all of a sudden they're keener out there to do things. A new buyer, people have decided over Christmas we're now going to go and do something.
We're very governed by school holidays and interruptions, and Easter and school holidays are coming up, so that'll definitely create a bit of a lull in the market. And coming out of that, May will be busy, and then June, July are quieter months, just because of the weather being prohibitive. It's a bit colder, but I have seen premium prices paid through winter.
Yep.
So it just depends whether people are ready or needing to go ahead and market their houses. If they want to do it during winter, there's still a market there.
Yeah.
But it's just not going to be as many people around. That's all the activities.
Demand and supply is also to be positive. There's not that many properties on the market. So,
but spring's good, and I agree. Early spring is probably better because late spring it can get a bit crowded, particularly if there's properties that have passed in. They then become casualties and add to the numbers that are there late in the year. The houses I've bought personally over the years, I've always done that in December. Because I think vendors are more motivated to sell as they're leading into the summer months. And you've got a lot of range. You've got quite a bit to choose from.
Why would a seller and an agent sell a property in the last week of the auction rather than just go to the Saturday?
Good question. There can be a variety of reasons for that. There could be a buyer who simply can't make the auction. They're travelling or overseas or have a business commitment or something like that they just can't be there. If that's the case, they may be encouraged to put their best foot forward before auction. Most of the time, though, we would not normally sell a property pre-auction unless a premium price was being offered, and it was obviously at our clients' expectations or higher. And then we'd still involve everyone else who's been through the property. So we have to be really clear with buyers that whilst you make an offer on a home pre-auction, you've got to be careful that not to expect that you're just getting a one-on-one negotiation, because we would be instructed by our client to canvass the interest of all other parties. So we're careful with the language that we use with people. I would say to you, Mel, if you wish to make an offer, that's fine. I'll take it to our client. They'll either say yes, but subject to the interest of other parties, or they'll say no in favour of going to auction on Saturday.
People come to us occasionally and say, well, Mal, there's no other buyers, why should we be paying this? And when I look in the eye and say, well, you need to be paying this because the vendor's not going to accept anything else, I think people don't quite understand that dynamic. Is that a buyer is competing against other buyers if they're there, but if they're not there, the buyer is still competing against the seller. And if it's a good property, or certainly if it's a reasonable property, if it's not a good property, well, why are you buying it? But if it's a reasonable or good property, you're still going to have to compete against the seller. So in that case, there's nothing wrong with buying before if that's what you want to do, if you're happy to pay it. What makes you think and do what you do in a post-auction situation?
Well, again, there's so many different scenarios that can unfold. But let's say there were a couple of people who bid, or 2 or 3 bidders, but it fell short of what the vendor wanted. Then obviously we protect the person who's the highest bidder. So they're given the right to come in and sit down and negotiate. Now, it's fair to say that agents practice what they're going to do after an auction without giving away any secrets. I will say
let's not give any secrets away, Scott.
No, but we do train for that. And that's why buyers should probably have someone like you in their corner, because a trained negotiator, and that's what we are post-auction, we will sit there and work out the best way to get the best price for our client.
I think you're politely saying that maybe the reserve that you come back with first is not actually the reserve that perhaps would have been during an auction situation. I'm not saying, of course, you'd exaggerate the reserve, but the reserve is very flexible. So,
well, that's the prerogative of the vendor to move their reserve after an auction. I call it a post-auction reserve. That can go up or down depending on what's happened at the time. We have very few buyers who come in and say we won't pay a cent more, because if you don't cooperate, then you're probably not going to get past first base. But as long as a buyer comes in and they're willing to cooperate and be reasonable, then we would of course suggest to our client to also be flexible and reasonable, and then try to bring it together as best we can.
So if you read out the auction rules and they say, and you'll be given the reserve, you'll be given first right to hear the reserve, or first right of refusal, or all these different words, but basically there still is the general sort of implication that, well, you'll be told what the reserve is, whether it was the reserve 3 hours ago or not, you're given a figure. And then if you as a buyer say no, well then technically, it doesn't really happen that often, but technically the selling agent is then free to go out and talk to anybody else because you've been told the reserve and you've refused the reserve. Is that...
Well, that's right, and I've actually thought about this over the years. I think that's something that should change, because that can be manipulated quite easily by an unscrupulous agent. They could do that.
Auctions, that's our favourite thing. And what I really like about you, Scott, and I should say this to start with, first of all, you're on time, generally speaking. Occasionally you're not, and I'll come and remind you of that. But generally speaking, you're on time, and also you don't speak forever. Why do auctioneers go on for 10, 15, 20 minutes about the property?
I think it's an old-fashioned thing. It's just a hangover from the olden days where that's what auctioneers used to do. They used to give a history lesson on the property in the area to everyone, and maybe they were interested in hearing it. I don't know, but they're certainly not now. I think a good auction's a quick auction.
Well, let's get to the bidding part. Let's just say, and what happens a lot of times here is that blah, 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 this is a fantastic house and I'm going to call for your bidding. Ladies and gentlemen, please, what's it worth? Let's hear from you. And then silence. Vendor bid. What is a vendor bid? When should you use a vendor bid? Can you use it multiple times? What does this all mean?
Well, in Melbourne, you can use a vendor bid more than once. It's not limited. In Sydney, it's only once. I don't mind that idea, but in Melbourne you can do it multiple times. Now, I say to my client, and every auctioneer does this differently, and that's why I'll explain it to my vendors before their auction. We typically have a meeting a day or two before, and that's when I'll explain to them that I will place on your behalf 1 or 2 vendor bids, but not more, because I think it looks a bit silly, and the buyers will probably all stand back if that's the case and just watch me continue to bid. So I'd rather put an opening vendor bid in that is essentially a line in the sand. If I got nothing from the audience, then I would, after about 10 or 15 seconds, put in a vendor bid. Okay, now that's probably the lower end of the indicative selling range. And it's probably a figure that they're not really wanting to sell for.
So it's not their reserve, it's just a figure to try and get the auction started.
It's a kickstart for the auction. And really the idea is that buyers will see that that's amazing value. They should put their hand up, because then they're putting themselves in the right position to buy the property. So we would use a vendor bid essentially at a very conservative level in order to stimulate people to get involved in the auction.
Right.
If I'm then met with silence after that, after naming perhaps a $10,000 or $20,000 increment, I would typically, me personally, I put a second one in, because I just try to create a little bit of momentum and just to move us in the right direction. And I might say something like that we're just moving a little closer to our client's expectation.
Let's look at another situation where quotes 3 to 3.3 and somebody opens up at 3.5. I might have known somebody that's done that a few times. What's your view? How do you deal with that? So it's 3 to 3.3. Somebody's come in and bid 3.5, and all of a sudden everybody's been talking and there's chatter, and then somebody said 3.5 and there's silence. There's dead silence. Nobody's saying anything. How do you deal with that?
Well, that's a tricky one. That is a really tricky situation. I think if there's any doubt, you have to pause and pop inside and see the vendor. But more likely, you've been given an instruction by the vendor before the auction begins. And if the vendor's reserve was much lower, then naturally it should be announced to be on the market. That's my view.
With auctions in particular, it's a lot more than just the auctioneer, or it's a lot more than just the head buyer agent. A lot of stuff does go on behind the scenes, and you've raised that there. A good auctioneer is, to a certain extent, only as good as the team behind him, and that's sounding a bit funny, but it's the truth. If you go into an auction and you're told by your selling agent, the person that's managing that property, that's a that's a buyer, or none of the buyers that we expected to hear, it does give you that sort of information to allow you to make the auction work better.
Absolutely. I think a lot of the hard work is done before the auctioneer turns up. Sometimes we're just there conducting the orchestra, as they say, getting all the bids. But other times we have to roll our sleeves up and really get involved and try and help. And that's when, back to strategy around post-auction negotiations, we'll also make sure that the person who has the most rapport with that individual buyer leads the negotiation, as opposed to necessarily the auctioneer doing that.
I'd like to finish off by just saying you're a lot more than just an auctioneer. You are a manager of people. You're a lot more than just a people pleaser. You do know how to manage people, and you manage people very well, which a lot of agents they don't have the ability, perhaps myself included. They're not good staff managers. I've never felt that about you, and your staff have never spoken poorly about you. So what's your secret, do you think, in managing, well, you're now managing 20 staff. What's your secret, do you think, in managing people?
I've always just felt you've got to take a fair approach. What is the right, fair, common sense outcome that we all want to achieve? And I think sometimes there has to be a bit of give and take. It can't just be one way. There has to be a bit of two-way traffic. But I'll always encourage people to put themselves in the other person's shoes, have a think about how they would feel if that happened to them, and just try to make sure that we get a fair outcome, because we've all got to work together in the future. It's not as if we have a big dust up and we're never talking to each other again. We've got to make sure, whether it be internal with colleagues, whether it be with buyers, with sellers, with advocates, with people that we deal with, there's ongoing relationships that need to be protected.
So let's just finish off with one sentence on four of these topics, if you don't mind. Just a quick sentence to finish off with, because I've really enjoyed this. It's been really good. Sure. Young auctioneers, what would be your best piece of your best piece of advice for them?
Be yourself, be authentic, park the ego at the door.
Women in real estate?
We have a number of exceptionally good women at Cane Burton who are top performers. Yep. So I think there's an emerging and growing community of women in real estate. And I think in a lot of ways they're more empathetic with people, emotionally intelligent as well, and I think they're going very well, and we need more of them.
I agree. I think you and I are practically dinosaurs in this world, and basically when you women in particular, if you were one woman versus one man as a general rule, if they're both experienced, you tend to be thinking that the woman is a better negotiator in a few areas, exactly for what you said. There's more of an emotional understanding about things and just seems to find the right points to make the deal happen. So I think that's true.
I'd like to see more women auctioneers.
Yep, I agree. Yep. I would certainly like to see more female auctioneers. It'd be good. Buyers and sellers. So let's just finish off with buyers. What's your one sentence of advice to buyers?
Advice to buyers, if you see the right property, don't hesitate.
Couldn't agree with you more. If it's right, buy it. If it's not, move on.
Yep.
Sellers?
Be open-minded, reasonable, flexible, and listen to the market and your agent.
Yep. I think that's a really good note to finish on. I really thank you for your time,
Thank
Scott.
you, Mel.
This has been a really, really enjoyable interview.
I've enjoyed it too.
Righto, mate. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.